Hello, welcome to another edition of Hindsight. I am David Hinds. I continue today to deal with the developments surrounding the suspension or proroguing of the parliament in Guyana. Today, I want to deal with a development that has not been given as much coverage as it should. And this has to do with the drumbeat on the part of the government and the media aligned to the government, that is the state-owned media and the Guyana Times. They have been keeping up a drumbeat as it relates to two calls. One was a call from Dr. Rupert Rupnarine, the co-leader of the Working People's Alliance and the vice chair of the APNU, who at the rally at the Square of the Revolution on Friday, November 17, said that no, that would be November 14. And he called for a boycott of the state media and the Guyana Times and suggested in true revolutionary fashion that what should happen is that a collection of those newspapers should be made and burnt at the Square of the Revolution as a symbolic act of resistance against those media who have not been fair in their coverage of events in Guyana. Everybody knows that the Guyana Times is a sympathizer, a defender of the PPP government, and that the state media, as it has done since independence, have always come down on the side of the governing party. In this case, under the PPP, my own observation is that they have taken it to further lengths than they have done before, in that they're unapologetically pro-PPP. I mean, to the point of hearing PPP releases over coverage of the opposition. So that is well known. And the call for a boycott of these media are not new. These calls have been there since in the time of the previous government, and they're not new now. So the question one has to ask is why this big drumbeat over Dr. Rupnarine's call for a boycott of the Guyana Times and the state media. The other incident that caught my attention and I want to talk about is the call by Lurley Nestor, former parliamentarian of the PNC and a very vocal activist of the Partnership for National Unity. Ms. Nestor on our website apparently called for a boycott of businesses that are in bed with the government and contribute towards the undemocratic practice of the government. Again, the call for boycott of businesses is not anything new. This is normal in societies like ours. It has been used in Guyana before, and so therefore there's nothing big and exciting about it. And so one must ask the question, why the Guyana Times and the state-owned media have latched on to Ms. Nestor's call for a boycott of businesses that are part of undemocratic, upholding the undemocratic practices of the government. Why the drumbeat? So the question here is why pick on the Nestor call for boycott of businesses and the Rupnarine call for a boycott of the state-owned media and the Guyana Times, which is aligned to the government. I want to proffer an answer, and that answer, I think, arises out of the narrative that the PPP has employed over the last 70 years. It is a narrative that drives that party and drives the political actions and words of that party. Let me say this, that in every society, political parties are driven by narratives. They're driven by their sense and their view of the world. Sometimes that view of the world is deeply ideological. Sometimes that view of the world is a reflection of the nature of the society. And the nature of Guyanese society, of course, cannot be understood outside of its ethnic and racial dynamics. And so I want to argue that there is a PPP narrative that has always driven that party. And that narrative is grounded in what I call ethnic and racial assumptions of the two major ethnic groups in Guyana. It's a narrative that constructs the Indian Guyanese as passive people, construct the Indian Guyanese as passive, as clannish, and but culturally superior. Passive, clannish, and culturally superior. It constructs the African Guyanese as violent, as prone to material inducements, as prone to protests, and as a people who are given to almost spontaneous action outside of reasoning. So it is the African Guyanese who is violent. It is the African Guyanese who is prone to a kind of spontaneous political action. It is the African Guyanese who is prone to inducements, material inducements. And of course, it is the African Guyanese who lacks culture and so is therefore culturally inferior. Culturally inferior. And I think these assumptions on the part of the PPP, of the two ethnic groups, then combine to propel a certain kind of praxis on the part of the PPP. And so if you construct that kind of analysis of the two ethnic groups, then what arises from that is the belief by the PPP of its divine rule, its divine right to govern the country. Because if Indians are passive, then they will always vote for the PPP because they're clannish and they're passive, and so therefore they will always vote for the PPP. They will, in spite of abuse by the PPP, they will stick to the PPP because they're passive. And they will always vote for the PPP because they're clannish. It is their party, it's an Indian party, and so they will always vote for the PPP. Now, if you combine that with the fact that the Indian Guyanese control the majority, then you can understand why the PPP thinks that it is its divine rule to govern Guyana. That is guaranteed by this unchangeable view of Indian Guyanese and the way in which they will act politically and otherwise. Now, what this means, therefore, is that if you construct the clannish Indian, then there is no room for Indian dissidents. There is no room for Indian dissident behavior. It is why the PPP behaved in such a vicious way when, in the 1960s, people like Balram Singh Rai and others formed dissident parties. They were pummeled by the PPP. It was why, when the WPA came on the scene in the 1970s, and it began to attract young Indians and other dissident Indians, that the PPP, despite its close alliance with the WPA, also reacted negatively. In fact, the PPP told the WPA not to campaign in Indian communities. That those Indian communities, the implication was that's their turf. And so therefore, the whole notion of dissident Indians is non-existent in the PPP's praxis. It means that any Indian who steps outside of the PPP is seen as the other, the Nimokaran syndrome. It is why there has always been that viciousness towards Indian Guyanese who have stepped outside of the PPP. From, like I said, Balram Singh Rai to Moses Bhagwan to Rupert Rupnarayan to Nagamutu and Ramkaran and the kind of viciousness towards Glenn Lal and his newspaper, the Kaitro News. It is grounded in that notion of the clannishness of East Indians. So if you step outside of the clan, it means therefore that you are the other, you are inferior, and you have to be otherized. that explains why there is this viciousness against the call by Roop Narain for a boycott of the Guyana Times. Here is an East Indian. Here is an East Indian calling for a protest against an East Indian government. And he's calling for boycott. He's using, according to the PPP, he's using the voice of the African, because the voice of protest is the voice of the African. The voice of militancy is the voice of the African. So here is an East Indian who's speaking an African voice. And so therefore he is the other. He's the other. Roop Narain is the other in this case, because he's using the African voice of protest, that quote-unquote violent voice. So what the Guyana Times and the state media are doing is, first of all, they're elevating a boycott of a newspaper to violence. And they're saying here is an East Indian who's doing that. And this East Indian who's calling for violence against his own government, calling for violence against an East Indian government, is the other. He's Oxford or Cambridge educated, so he's not East Indian. He's there as part of this African cabal. And so it is for that reason that you see the excitement on the part of the PPP and the Guyana Times over a simple, normal call to boycott newspapers and media outlets that are biased. It's a normal call. Everybody makes this call. The PPP made the same call when it was in the opposition. And so the point I'm making here is the excitement over the call has very little to do with the call and more to do with this whole construct that the PPP has erected over a period of time. The Indian dissident who has to be authorized, and the elevating of any protest that comes out of the African camp, the African Guyanese camp, elevating it to violence. In fact, the Guyana Times has reminded Roop Narain of his charge of arson, of burning down, and so he's calling for burning the newspapers. It's like burning down Georgetown and doing what Africans do best, burning down. One has to understand what is sinister here. Part of the PPP construct is that African protest is not grounded in grievance. Africans are not driven by grievance. When African protest, it is out of this inherent love affair with violence. In fact, one Indian Guyanese theorist who is rumored to be an advisor of the PPP and is one of the PPP's top propagandists, he argued that the African response to their oppression, response to slavery, colonialism, segregation in the United States, that constant African response to oppression has created in the African reflexes an almost natural inclination to violence. And so he's arguing violence has become almost second nature, if not first nature, for Africans because of these long years of having to respond to oppression. Now, of course, he does not see that those long years of resistance has created those long years of resistance, the long period of resistance, have created an African civilization that is anti anything that is democratic, undemocratic, anti-racism, anti-classism, anti-imperialism. He doesn't see that. What he sees is that coming out of these centuries of resistance is the violent African. And so that violence becomes synonymous with African behavior. When an African protests, it's not about some grievance which he or she has. It is grounded in this, what they call this natural, almost natural, primordial affinity to violence. And so it is against that background that one has to understand why the call by Ms. Nestor for boycott of newspapers is then elevated to a violent call. All she was doing is saying boycott businesses. Sorry, not newspapers. That's Ruth Narayan. Boycott businesses. Now, what does that have to do with violence? But you see, if your construction is that the African is violent and the African moves not from a position of grievance but from a position of violence, then even the most non-violent call is then elevated to violent status. Hence, the excitement over the call by Miss Nestor for a boycott of businesses. And so what I'm trying to explain here is what is behind the political actions of the PPP. What is behind all of this excitement over two calls, which has become, if you will, normal fare in Guyanese and Caribbean politics. But here it is elevated to the position of violence and mayhem and so forth. One has to understand the PPP as a plan. The plan of the PPP is that let us prorogue Parliament. And in the process of doing that, what we will do is provoke protest from the opposition. And that protest will do two things. That protest will reinforce what we have always argued in the Indian Guyanese community, is that the Africans are violent. They are not concerned at all with any normalcy in the society. They're concerned with violence. Here they are being violent again. All right? The second thing it is aimed to do is to either drive a wedge between the AFC and the APNU, or present the AFC as here are some Indian leaders, Namakarans, people who are authorized, who have gotten your votes, and as we have said, that they have taken your votes not to represent your interests, but to join with the Africans, to join with the violent Africans to work against your interests. And so it is two-pronged to draw the African Guyanese, the APNU, into protest, then to elevate that protest to violence, and to, of course, induce solidarity action on the part of the AFC and the APNU, and then use that to show that the AFC is not pro-Indian, that the AFC stands on the side of African and African violence against East Indians. If the AFC does not fall for that bait and then stay away from any kind of solidarity with the APNU, then that will be explained to the East Indian constituency of them being crooks. Here they are fooling you, conning you. They join with the APNU to file a no confidence vote against us. And now what they're doing is trying to fool you by appearing in public not to associate with the APNU. And so therefore it is very clear that the PPP's approach here, the PPP's going to a proroguing of the parliament is grounded in that whole construct that the PPP has developed over the years. Part of the construct is that in the 1960s, based on this notion of the East Indian majority, the PPP was cheated out of office. That is very much part of the PPP's narrative, that they were cheated out of this office that is their divine right by virtue of this majority, by virtue of the superiority, by virtue of the clannishness of East Indians. And this is their construction of what East Indians are. And that in the ensuing 28 years, that the PNC proceeded to govern in a way that that militated against the interests of East Indians, that was violent to East Indians, that preventing East Indians from flowering, from preventing East Indians from living normally. It was governance based on economic advantage, advantage of Indian women, advantage of Indian workers, and all those things that have to do with African violence and the violent African. And so therefore, part of what we are doing here is defending Indians. By being in power, we are ensuring that Indians are defended. But more than that, part of what we are doing here is a kind of ethnic and class superiority, which of course came out in the discourse on that famous tape where the Attorney General was conversing with his friend in what he thought was an innocent private conversation. But out of that conversation we saw and we heard very clearly how caste, make that race is part of the construction of the PPP and its leadership. And so therefore, being in office is not just about winning an election, it's about defending the race. It's about elevating the race to its rightful status of being in charge. Because after all, Africans are violent, Africans are temperamental, Africans are authoritarian by nature, and so they're not fit to govern. They are culturally inferior and therefore are not fit to govern other races. This is the narrative that is impelling and propelling the PPP, and we have to understand their actions against this context. Now, where does that leave us, having made that analysis and explained the PPP's action? Now, it means, therefore, that one has to have a strategy, one has to have a counter to that narrative. And I think that it is incumbent on the PPP, it is incumbent on the representative of Africans in particular to come up with a strategy to work against that kind of narrative. It is incumbent on the leaders in the AFC to also counter that narrative. If the AFC behaves as it is behaving, then it is reinforcing that narrative. And that rather than confronting that narrative and fighting and to develop a counter-narrative within the East Indian community. When the leader of the APNU quickly dismissed Ms. Nestor's call, and although he did not do so explicitly in relationship to the Rupnarine call, but when he made that response that we are not for boycotting anything, then he plays into that narrative. He plays into that narrative of yes, there is some kind of propensity on the part of African activists to move into those directions, but we are not moving into those directions. Now, that of course was not Mr. Granger's intention. His intention was really to blunt what obviously is the plot and the plan of the PPP, to induce violence in the society or to create the conditions where it can say the society is being violent. That was his intention, but his intention has larger consequences. And the larger consequence is that he then plays into the narrative that African people are prone to violence, and that Rupnarine's call and Lordy Nestor's call is put within that context, as the PPP and the Guyana Times are trying to do. So here we are. It is always important to understand the subtext behind political action. Political action is not always what appears on the surface. The PPP has been very fortunate in terms of it hiding that narrative that I have described, hiding that kind of praxis, largely because it has been able to construct the PNC as the riggers, the PNC as undemocratic, the PNC as authoritarian. And so if you construct your opponent, and in this case probably your enemies, as something, as rigging, as authoritarian, as dictatorial, then it means that you are able to rig, you're able to be authoritarian, you're able to be dictatorial and not being blamed for it, because you've already constructed your enemy, constructed your opponents as that. And so you do not get sanctioned. It is why the PPP, where there's evidence of rigging of elections in 2011, that the PPP was able to in turn accuse the opposition, accuse the APNU of rigging the elections, because they've been successful in applying the tag of rigging to the PNC, and so it gets away. The other reason the PPP has gotten away is that over the years it has been able to paint itself in ideological terms. It's a communist party, it's a Marxist party. And yes, it was that in terms of its rhetoric and perhaps in terms of its practice. But going hand in hand with that Marxism was also a racial reflexes, and a praxis that was grounded in race. And so therefore Marxism and communism were used as a mask for the PPP's praxis that was grounded in race. And so the PPP has been able to get away. So part of why it is bellyaching right now is that there is some traction to the construction of its latest action in dictatorial terms. And they're very, very excited about that, excited in a negative sense, about being labeled authoritarian and dictatorial, because that is the label they've used on their opponents. And now that label apparently would stick on them. They're very, very nervous about that, because they are not the authoritarian group. They are not the dictatorial group. They do not arise out of that culture. And so therefore they could not be possibly dictatorial and authoritarian. And that's why the president has said, I have acted in a dictatorial way. That's not his word, those are my words. I have prorogued the parliament, but that has nothing to do with authoritarianism and dictatorial. That has to do with my democratic right. So taking away the right of people to govern themselves is being constructed by the PPP as a democratic action. And so therefore, it is incumbent on the other parties, the APNU and the AFC, to study what propels the PPP. And if you study that and you understand that, then you are in a better position to come up with an alternative strategy to that narrative, which is very, very deeply rooted in the psyche of the community which the PPP represents. And the PPP has refreshed that over a period of 70 years. Now, in any society, of course, that narrative is part myth and part reality. Part myth and part reality. And it is the part that it is that is myth that one has to zero in on. If young East Indians are not voting for the PPP, are protesting against the PPP, are standing up to the PPP, that goes against the narrative of clannishness. If East Indian intellectuals like Rupnarayan and so forth are going against the PPP, that goes against the narrative of clannishness. And so therefore, what it says to us is that there is a reality and there is a myth of that narrative. And the myth of that narrative is that ethnic solidarity is not unchanging. Ethnic solidarity is something that changes over a period of time. Sometimes it changed in a progressive way. It goes back. East Indians had moved to the WPA in the 70s, and then they went back to the PPP. Now they've moved to the AFC and so forth. One has to understand that ethnic loyalties, while there is a grounded nature to it, nevertheless, these are changing things. It's a changing phenomenon. And so people have to always, those political people, have to always keep their ear on the ground and to study and to see when those shifts are happening and to be able to take advantage in a positive way, of those shifts. My own sense is that at this moment, there is a shift that is going on in the East Indian community in relationship to that entrenched solidarity that the PPP's Praxis is grounded in. And so part of why it's in trouble, it's because of that shift. And it has not been able to adjust its own reflexes to that shift. It still continues to ground its action in this old perspective. And so whenever the shift occurs and that perspective doesn't change, we have what we have. Well, thank you for tuning into yet another edition of Hindsight. You can catch my other commentaries on my YouTube, site, and it's on Hinds'Sight, HINDSSIGHT. You can catch my other commentaries there, and of course you can catch my other writings on my website, Guyana-Caribbean Until the next time, David Hinds, thanking you for your patience. See you next time.